Now, I have the full transcript. Let me write the new story. I sat on my porch the way I always did on Tuesday mornings. Coffee in one hand, the newspaper folded across my knee. Watching the light come through the pine trees along the fence line. The neighborhood was quiet. A cardinal landed on the bird feeder my wife Margaret had hung before she passed. 3 years ago now. And I watched it for a moment before going back to my reading. That was when my son-in-law pulled into the driveway. Earlier than I expected. He'd told me he had a job interview at 10. It was barely 8:30. He sat in his car for nearly 5 minutes before getting out. And something about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, checking his phone before pocketing it, made me lower the newspaper. I'd been a civil engineer for 34 years. I'd built bridges over rivers and overpasses above highway interchanges, and I'd learned early in my career that the smallest details, a hairline fracture in a support beam, a quarter-inch of settling on one side, were the things that eventually brought everything down. I had the kind of eyes that found hairline fractures. That was how I'd survived my career. And watching my son-in-law walk from his car to my front door that morning, I felt that old tightening in my chest that meant something wasn't right. His name was Derek. My daughter Claire had married him 4 years ago. And for 2 of those years, he and Claire had been living under my roof. He'd lost his sales manager position when the company downsized, and Claire's remote work as a freelance graphic designer barely covered their car payment and groceries. I hadn't thought twice about telling them to move in. My house had 4 bedrooms, and I was 64 years old and rattling around in it alone. Family helps family. That was how I'd been raised. Derek was 37, broad-shouldered, pleasant enough in company. The kind of man who told good jokes at dinner and remembered to shake your hand firmly when you first met. He'd treated Claire well, as far as I could see, and I'd grown to like him genuinely. Over the first year they lived with me, he helped with the yard. He fixed the gutter that had been pulling away from the eave for 2 seasons. He sat with me on Saturday afternoons and watched college football. But something had shifted in him over the last few months. He'd started going quiet in ways that felt calculated rather than peaceful. He took his phone outside when it rang. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. He laughed a beat too late at things. Like he was monitoring the room before he allowed himself to react. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I filed it away the way I'd always filed things. Quietly, methodically, waiting to understand what I was looking at. That Tuesday morning, Derek came in through the front door, nodded at me through the screen, said he'd forgotten something, and went upstairs. Claire had driven to the library to use the printer and wouldn't be back for an hour. I folded my newspaper slowly and sat still, listening to the footsteps above me. They moved from the hallway to the bedroom, then to the guest room, then back to the hallway. I set my coffee on the porch rail and went inside. The guest room door was pulled almost shut. I stood in the hallway. The footsteps had stopped. I pushed the door open. Derek was crouched in front of the closet. The old wooden panel at the back of it pulled aside. I'd built that hidden compartment 20 years ago. A project I'd taken on after Margaret's mother passed, and we'd needed somewhere to store the family documents and valuables during an estate transfer. 4 people had ever known about it. Me, Margaret, Claire, and the attorney who'd helped us with the paperwork at the time. The safe inside was open. Derek heard me and spun around on his heels. And for a single, suspended moment, we looked at each other across the small room. He stood up slowly. His face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise. Calculation. Something that tried to become innocence and didn't quite make it. I didn't speak. I looked past him at the open safe. I could see it from where I stood. The wooden box with Margaret's jewelry was there. But I already knew from the angle and the open lid that the diamond earrings she'd inherited from her mother were gone. The insurance documents were still in their envelope, The cash I kept for emergencies, $4,000 in a sealed bank envelope, had been taken from its place. I looked back at Derek. He said, Raymond, I can explain. People who need to explain things are rarely explaining them for your benefit. I said, close the panel and come downstairs. He followed me to the kitchen. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and stood at the counter rather than sitting. Because sitting would have felt like a concession, like I was settling in for a conversation rather than a reckoning. Derek stood near the table, his weight shifting slightly from foot to foot. I said, the combination to that safe has been known to 3 people: my wife, my daughter, and me. My wife has been dead for 3 years. He opened his mouth. I said, don't. He closed it. You told Claire the combination. Or she told you. Either way, you opened it. I kept my voice level. The voice I'd used in 30 years of project meetings when a contractor had made an error that would cost money and time and needed to understand that clearly without any ambiguity. Where are the earrings? His jaw tightened. Raymond. We're behind on everything. The credit cards are maxed, and Claire doesn't know how bad it is. I was going to put it back. I just needed to cover the payment this week. Buy myself a few days to figure out, where are the earrings? He exhaled slowly. I pawned them yesterday. Margaret's mother had worn those earrings to my wedding. Margaret had worn them to Claire's wedding. They were not mine to lose. They were not his to take. I set down my coffee cup with careful precision and said, go upstairs and put the cash back. All of it. He went without arguing, which told me something about his state of mind, that the fight had gone out of him faster than he'd expected. He came back down 2 minutes later with the bank envelope and set it on the kitchen table. I picked it up and counted it without making a show of it. The full $4,000. I put the envelope in my shirt pocket. I'm going to need you to write down the name and address of the pawn shop. I said. He wrote it on the notepad I slid across the counter. Now, I need you to sit down and think carefully about whether you want to tell Claire what you've done, or whether you'd prefer I do it when she gets home. He sat down. His shoulders dropped. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, entirely his age, which was to say young in the wrong ways, unprepared for the weight of what he'd chosen. I took my coffee and went back out to the porch. My hands were steady. That surprised me. And then it didn't. I'd spent 3 decades doing work where a shaking hand or a wavering judgment caused real damage. Measurable damage. The kind you could see from a highway overpass. You trained yourself out of panic. You trained yourself into the next correct step. The next correct step was to think clearly before I acted. Claire came home 40 minutes later. I heard her car in the driveway. Heard the front door. Heard her call my name from the hallway. In that bright way she had. I went inside. She knew something was wrong. The moment she saw my face. Claire had always been that way. Perceptive. Reading a room the way some people read words. Effortlessly and with perfect retention. She'd gotten it from her mother. I said, come sit down with me. Derek was still in the kitchen. He couldn't look at her. I told her what I'd found. I told her about the safe. The missing earrings. The cash. I told her what Derek had said about the pawn shop and the credit card debt. I told her all of it the way I would have presented it, in a project debrief. Without editorializing. Without raising my voice. Just the sequence of events in the order they occurred. Claire sat very still through all of it. When I finished, she turned to Derek. And whatever passed between them in that moment was not something I could adequately describe. Some reckonings happen entirely in silence. She said to him, my grandmother wore those earrings. He said, I know. She said, how long have we been in this much trouble? He said. About 8 months. She closed her eyes. She didn't cry. Not then. That wasn't Claire's way. She processed things privately and came back later with decisions. It was a quality I'd always admired in her. I excused myself and went upstairs to make some calls. The first call was to the pawn shop. I identified myself and explained that items had been pawned there the previous day, using a combination of marital property and family property that the individual had no legal right to sell. The owner was a pragmatic man named Garth, who'd been in the pawn business for 20 years and knew exactly where this conversation was heading. He told me what Derek had received for the earrings. I nearly had to put the phone down. $650. Margaret's mother's earrings, with their certified appraisal of $4,200, had been sold for $650 to cover a credit card minimum payment. I told Garth I'd be in the next morning, with documentation of ownership and a buyback payment. The second call was to my attorney, a measured and precise woman named Sandra Howell, who I'd worked with on contracts for 20 years. I told her what had happened in the same unembellished terms I'd used with Claire. She listened without interrupting and then asked me 3 questions: whether anything else had gone missing that I hadn't yet discovered, whether Derek had any history of this behavior that I knew of, and what outcome I wanted. That third question required more thought than the first 2. I said, I want my daughter's inheritance protected. I want the earrings back. And I want to make certain this can never happen again. Sandra said she'd draft a revised estate document and a formal agreement outlining terms of continued residency. She'd have a preliminary version to me within 48 hours. I went back downstairs. Claire and Derek were sitting at the kitchen table, not touching, not speaking. The specific silence of a conversation that had exhausted itself. Derek looked up when I came in. Claire didn't. I sat down across from them and said, Here's what happens now. I'd thought about it while I was on the phone, and I knew my own mind clearly. I told Derek that I was going to the pawn shop in the morning and buying back the earrings. The $650 I spent doing that would come out of the household expenses he and Claire had been contributing to each month, which was to say, effectively, out of their pockets. Not mine. I told him I'd spoken to my attorney and that we would be drawing up a formal residency agreement with specific terms including full financial transparency going forward, monthly accounting of debts, and a clear timeline for them to achieve financial independence. I told him that the combination to the safe had been changed as of that afternoon, and that I would be having the lock on the guest room closet panel replaced with a keyed mechanism to which only I held a key. I told him that if anything of mine ever went missing again, for any reason, under any circumstances, I would involve the police without hesitation and without any prior conversation. Derek nodded throughout this. He had the particular stillness of a person absorbing consequences they know they deserve. Then I looked at Claire and I said, I love you. None of this changes that. But I need you to be honest with me about what's happening in your household. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were bright and tired. I didn't know it was this bad. She said, I believe you. I said, and I did. The next morning I drove to Garth's pawn shop before it opened and waited in the parking lot with my coffee in a thermos and Margaret's insurance documentation in the folder on the passenger seat. Garth unlocked the door at 9 and seemed unsurprised to see me there. He was a stocky man in his late 50s, with careful eyes and a practiced courtesy that I respected. He'd been buying and selling other people's difficult moments for 2 decades, and he conducted himself without judgment, which was a professional quality I could appreciate. He brought the earrings out from the display case in a small velvet bag. I opened it, turned the earrings over in my palm, checked the hallmarks against the insurance documentation. They were Margaret's. No damage. No alteration. I paid the $650 in cash, received a receipt, and put the earrings in my breast pocket. I sat in the parking lot for a while after that, not ready to drive yet. I'd been holding a particular feeling at arm's length since the moment I'd pushed open the guest room door and seen Derek crouched in front of the open safe. I'd held it at arm's length through the conversation at the kitchen table and the calls to Sandra and Garth, and through the long, quiet evening I'd spent alone in my study while Claire and Derek spoke in low voices upstairs. I'd been professional about all of it, measured and deliberate, and that was the right way to handle it. But now in the parking lot with the earrings in my pocket, I let myself feel it. Betrayal doesn't come from strangers. Strangers can't reach the places where betrayal does its real damage. Derek had lived in my house for 2 years. He'd eaten at my table. He'd sat beside me watching football on Saturday afternoons, and I'd thought, on more than one occasion, that whatever happened with his work situation, I was glad he was in Claire's life. I'd been glad, and he'd opened my safe and taken Margaret's earrings to a pawn shop. I sat with that for a few minutes. Then I started the car and drove to Sandra's office. She had the preliminary documents ready. As promised, I spent 2 hours at her conference table reading through each page with the same methodical attention I brought to structural blueprints. Sandra had been thorough. The revised estate document clarified the provenance of all family heirlooms and established their status as items specifically excluded from any claim by non-blood relations. The residency agreement outlined the terms I described to Derek: monthly financial disclosures, a 12-month timeline toward independence, the formal understanding that any further breach of trust would constitute grounds for immediate termination of residency. There was also a clause Sandra had added without my asking that I read twice before acknowledging it. It stipulated that any future civil action arising from events that had already occurred would not be waived by signing this agreement. In plain language, it meant I could still pursue Derek legally for the theft, if I chose to, regardless of what he signed. I asked Sandra about that. She said, "You may feel differently in 6 months. I want you to have the option." I told her that was good thinking, and I meant it. That afternoon, Derek and Claire came to Sandra's office and we sat around the conference table together. Sandra explained each document in plain terms. She didn't editorialize, and she didn't soften anything, which was why I'd worked with her for 20 years. Derek read everything carefully, asked 2 questions about the financial disclosure requirement that showed he'd actually read the text and wasn't just waiting to sign, and then signed where indicated. Claire signed as a co-occupant. I signed as the property owner. It was, in its way, a businesslike thing. And there was something clarifying about treating it that way. A line had been drawn. Terms had been established. Everyone in the room understood what they were. On the drive home, I thought about what the next months would look like. I thought about the awkwardness of breakfasts and the careful way we'd all navigate the hallways. I thought about whether Derek could actually rebuild himself into someone trustworthy, or whether this was the kind of fracture that propagated silently until the structure failed. I didn't know the answer. That was honest. What I knew was that I had chosen not to destroy my daughter's marriage the moment I discovered what her husband had done. I'd chosen it deliberately and with open eyes, not out of naivety, but because Claire was my daughter and she was 34, and she deserved the chance to decide what she wanted her life to be with full information, rather than having the decision made for her by the fallout from my anger. But I had also chosen to protect myself. That was equally deliberate. The revised will sat in Sandra's safe. The residency agreement was signed and filed. The safe combination had been changed, and the closet panel locked with a key that sat on my keychain. The earrings were back in the safe, which now had a secondary alarm component that would send an alert to my phone if the door was opened. I was not naive. I was not helpless. And I was not finished watching. The weeks that followed had a surface that looked something like normal. Derek started a new job, a regional sales role he'd found through a former colleague. Mid-level but steady, with health benefits and a salary that would actually cover his obligations. He left the house early and came home at a reasonable hour and was quieter than he'd been before, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The loudness he'd had before, the ease and the jokes, had always sat slightly forward of him, like a man standing in front of something he didn't want you to see. This quieter version felt more real. Claire had requested access to their full financial picture, and Derek had provided it. She came to me one evening with a spreadsheet on her laptop and sat at the kitchen table and walked me through it without embarrassment, which took more courage than I would have expected and made me proud of her in a way that was difficult to articulate. The debt was significant, but manageable within the residency timeline Sandra had outlined. They were not going to drown. I reviewed the spreadsheet carefully and then asked her one question. "Is there anything on here that surprises you?" she said. "Most of it." We sat with that for a moment. I said, "Then you know what you need to know." She nodded and closed the laptop. Each month, per the agreement. Derek provided a one-page financial summary. I reviewed it, filed it, said nothing unless there was something to say. There wasn't. The debt was going down. The credit cards were not being used. His paychecks were going where they were supposed to go. I watched, not with suspicion exactly, or not only with suspicion, with the attention you pay to something that has been compromised and is in the process of being repaired. The attention an engineer pays to a structural element that has been stressed beyond its rated load and survived. You don't stop watching it, but you don't tear it out if it's holding. 6 months into the new arrangement, I got a call from Sandra. She told me that Derek had contacted her office directly. He'd asked whether there was a process by which he could make formal restitution for the earrings, meaning not simply repaying the pawnshop cost I'd covered, but the full appraised value of $4,200. He'd asked whether there was a document she could prepare that would make it official, something in writing that acknowledged what he'd done and committed him formally to the repayment. Sandra said he'd been specific about wanting it documented. He hadn't asked her to inform me. She was informing me as a courtesy. I sat with the phone against my ear and looked out my study window at the backyard. Sandra asked if I wanted to proceed. I said yes. The agreement took 2 weeks to finalize. Derek signed it in Sandra's office without Claire present, at his own request. He'd wanted it to be his action, not a joint one. I could respect that. He'd set up automatic monthly payments into a dedicated account Sandra maintained as an escrow. Small amounts. Amounts that fit realistically within his budget, but consistent and documented. He didn't apologize in that meeting. He'd apologized once, the evening after everything came out, in the kitchen, in the stilted and incomplete way of a man who doesn't yet fully understand what he's apologizing for. He didn't try again in Sandra's office, and I appreciated that more than another apology would have meant. Actions and apologies are different currencies, and only one of them compounds over time. On the drive home from Sandra's office that afternoon, I took a longer route, one that passed through the older part of town where Margaret and I had lived when we were young, before the children and before the house, with the pine trees along the fence. The streets were narrow and the houses were small, and I drove slowly, which was allowed. Margaret would have handled all of this differently than I had. She would have been angrier faster and forgiven faster, and the whole thing would have had more noise and more tears and probably more talking. And it would have been resolved in days rather than months. That was how she'd been built. Quick to fire and quick to cool. I was slower in both directions, but we'd ended up in the same place. I thought, you protect your family. You protect what they leave you, and you hold people accountable for what they take. I turned back toward home. The pine trees were catching the late afternoon light when I pulled into the driveway. Through the kitchen window I could see Claire moving around, starting dinner from the look of it. Derek's car was in the garage. The Cardinal was at the bird feeder. I sat in the driveway for a moment with the engine off. My father's generation had a phrase for what I'd done. Not the confrontation or the legal documents or the watched months that followed, but the whole of it. The choice to stay present and engaged rather than cutting clean and walking away. They called it holding the line. It wasn't sentiment. It was precision, knowing where the boundary was and standing at it. Not behind it and not past it. I got out of the car, picked up my briefcase from the back seat, and walked toward the house where my daughter was making dinner and my son-in-law was trying to become someone worth trusting, and where Margaret's earrings were back in the safe, where they belonged. I opened the front door. I checked my watch. Margaret's mother's earrings. The line held. Time to go inside. If you've stayed with me this far, I'd appreciate you hitting the like button and leaving a comment. Tell me what time it is where you are right now. And if this story spoke to something you've lived through, I want to hear about it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for being here.